Hi, welcome to the Itihasa channel. Today we talk about what happens after the training was over for the Kuru princes, both the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendraya Namaha, Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Anjanaya Namaha, Om Subramanyaya Namaha, Swami Sharnamayappo, Om Guruve Namaha. So 12 long years, the Kuru princes stayed in the ashram of Dronacharya. Their only contact with the outside world was Bhishma, who would come once in a while to the ashrama to check on Dronacharya, ask him if he needed anything, to find out how the princes were doing, whether things were going well, if there was any deficiencies on the side of the Hastinapur court, the royal family, and that whether Drona was happy with everything. And it was only during these times that Bhishma would get a chance to interact with the princes, to talk to them, to meet them. And there would be a general time when the princes would show off what they've learned, and Bhishma would be proud and happy about what he's seen. And of course, Dronacharya also would keep Bhishma updated, would show him what the things he taught, the astras he's taught to the princes. And so it went on for 12 years. But in these 12 years, the parents of these Kuru princes had not seen them. Kunti had not seen the Pandavas, and Dhritarashtra and Gandhari had not met the Kaurava princes. And over these 12 years, these boys had blossomed into young, handsome, tough men. They joined this ashrama when they were barely young teenagers, between 17 and 14 years of age. If you take Yudhishthira being the oldest and Nakula and Sahadeva being the youngest and the Kauravas being around the age of Bhimasena. So these boys joined this Gurukula around the time when they were between 17 to 14 years of age. And it had been 12 long years from there. So they were between 29 and 25 years of age, strapping young lads. They had grown, they had blossomed into young, handsome men and very capable warriors and very knowledgeable people, for even theoretical knowledge had been given at this time. The ashrama was a very rigorous schedule, for Dronacharya had ensured that it was like a regimented barracks at that time. The day would start for them at 4 o'clock, and they were supposed to get up at 4, rush down to the river, have a wash to freshen themselves, and then come back immediately to the ashrama, bringing their water pots to fill the urns for the bathing of the guru and for the cooking that would happen. And theory training would begin depending on when they reached after their bath. And it was during this time that Dronacharya had given the bigger pot to Ashwathama so that Ashwathama would come in earlier. But eventually, Arjuna made up for that by learning the Varunastra from Bhishma and filling his pot before everyone else. And we know about that story, we discussed it at an earlier episode. And so from 6 o'clock for 2 hours, these princes would do rigorous yoga training to ensure that their muscles become supple, their joints become lax, and the body gets core strength. This was followed by a sumptuous breakfast and then active war training. Training in the art of archery, in the art of swordsmanship, the fighting with the mace, with the spear, fighting on horses, on chariots, and on elephants. Following this intense training for 12 years, these boys had blossomed into fierce warriors. And Dronacharya knew that it was now time to show off the capacity of these warriors to the palace, to the royals of the palace. More so to show off what he had done with these young boys when they had come. How he had transformed these young boys into warriors. And so during one of these visits of Bhishma, he told Bhishma that these boys are ready for war, these boys are ready to fight. And he would like to show the capacity and the abilities of these boys to the royal family. And Bhishma told him, then it's time you came to the palace to announce that yourself. Come to the palace and announce yourself that you would like to have an exhibition to showcase the talents of these students, of these young Kuru princes. And so on the appointed day, Dronacharya, finally wearing those beautiful silks that were gifted to him, and wearing a beautiful silk robe, came into the palace. He was announced into the palace, and he came in the presence of all the great people of the palace. There in attendance at the head on the main throne sat Dhritarashtra, the blind king, Pandu's elder brother, who had then taken over the rulership of the land after Pandu had died, or rather after Pandu had gone into the Shatashringa. Next to Dhritarashtra sat the great Pitamaha Bhishma, in absolute white, looking as regal as ever. And that day in attendance in the great palace was also the great Rishi Vedavyasa, deciphering that there was something ahead and there was a game changer in the great Hastinapur court. The great Vedavyasa had come down from the Himalayas to the Hastinapur court and was present on the day Dronacharya made his announcement. Also present was the great Kripacharya, Vidura, the younger brother of Dhritarashtra and Pandu, and also King Bahalika. So who was King Bahalika? We'll go into a slight segue and discuss about King Bahalika. So we know Bhishma's father was Shantanu, the great king who had taken over from his father Pratipa. Now Shantanu was not the only son of King Pratipa. In fact, he was a youngest son. King Pratipa and his wife Sunanda had 3 children. The eldest was Prince Devapi, the middle one was Prince Bahalika, and the youngest was Shantanu. Devapi was being groomed to be the king of the Hastinapur family, the king of the Kuru throne. He was a righteous man, he was a brave man. He was a great man who conducted various yajnas, was generous to a fault, gave away large amounts of land to his people, cows and gold and jewels, and went for wars far and wide in his younger years to conquer neighboring lands. King Pratipa had decided to make his elder son Devapi the king of Hastinapur, and so he decided to give his second son Bahalika a kingdom far away from Hastinapur to rule on his own. It was a rich kingdom which was then known by the name of Bahalika. And so Bahalika went to his kingdom to rule, which was somewhere south of Kashmir, today's Kashmir. And King Pratipa decided to anoint Devapi as the Yuvaraja of Hastinapur. However, unfortunately, around that time, Devapi contracted leprosy. It is said that he had a very vile skin condition which caused him to have deformities on his limbs. And this was quite terrible. And it was said that even though Pratipa badly wanted to make Devapi the king of Hastinapur, the courtiers and the citizens decided that it would not be right to have a king who would be deformed in his limbs. For then the kingdom of Hastinapur would be seen as a weaker kingdom, and that would not be acceptable, and they would be subject to assault by the other kings who would come and attack Hastinapur. And so King Pratipa had to listen to the subjects and to the citizenry. And listening to this, he had to, with a heavy heart, tell Devapi that he would not be able to become king. And Devapi gladly accepted his situation and decided to go to the forest and do penance, and took Vanaprasthan. In the meantime, Pratipa decided to call back Bahalika, but Bahalika had already gone to his country and was ruling there, and said that he wouldn't want to come back and rule Hastinapur, and it would be right to allow Shantanu to be the king. And so, with a heavy heart, King Pratipa decided to make his youngest son Shantanu the king of Hastinapur. And so we know the story of how Bhishma was born after that. And so Shantanu was the youngest of the 3 brothers, Devapi and Bahalika, all 3 sons of King Pratipa and Sunanda, his wife. And so King Bahalika ruled his country, also known as Bahalika. He ruled it well and ruled it wisely, and was a great warrior of his own. Over time, he had a son called Somadatta, and Somadatta himself had a son called Bhurishravas. And as Bahalika started becoming older and older, he started spending more and more time in Hastinapur rather than his own kingdom. For he had given his kingdom to Somadatta to take care of, and later Somadatta in turn gave it to Bhurishravas to take care of. And so there was a large palace kept available for Bahalika's use at all times. And Bahalika would spend his time, most of his time in Hastinapur, and he would go intermittently to his original kingdom, Bahalika, to spend time there. It is said, and I'm not really sure if it's true, but the surname Bahal, which is quite common in Bharatvarsha, was from descendants of this country of Bahalika. Anyway, Bahalika himself was quite often in the court of Dhritarashtra and the Hastinapur court. He would obviously always regard the present king of Hastinapur as the true king. He would never interfere in the going on of the court, but he would always be around, and in most of the important occasions mentioned in the Mahabharata, the king Bahalika was said to be there present in the court of Hastinapur. He was there in the court of Hastinapur when the remains of Pandu and Madri were brought down from Shatashringa. And he was there today when the great Dronacharya came to announce the fact that the training for the princes was over. He was also there when the exhibition was conducted and the great princes, Kuru princes, showed off their abilities. He was also there much later when Yudhishthira was performing his Rajasuya Yajna. In fact, when Yudhishthira had sent his 4 brothers to the different 4 corners of Bharatvarsha to conquer the various countries, Nakula was the one who had gone to the kingdom of Bahalika. And there he was greeted by this great patriarch with open arms and told that the kingdom of Bahalika will always be part of the kingdom of Hastinapur. And for the Rajasuya Yajna, Bahalika had brought a golden chariot as a gift for Yudhishthira. This was also the Yajna where Ekalavya had come and brought a pair of wooden sandals inlaid with gold. Bahalika also was there during the game of dice at that importune moment when Draupadi was pulled out from the ladies' quarters. And he was one of the people who was silent at the time, along with all the other elders in that court. He was always a well-wisher for the Kuru kingdom. And at the time when the war became imminent and when Krishna came as a messenger, Bahalika was one of the people who strongly and vociferously told everybody that peace should be maintained, that the Hastinapur kingdom should not be split, that the Hastinapur kingdom should not be cut up. But of course, no one listened to Bahalika at that time. King Bahalika's voice went to deaf ears. And finally, in the great Mahabharata war, King Bahalika fought. At the time of the Mahabharata war, Bhishma regarded King Bahalika to be an Atiratha, an Atirati, someone who can fight 60,000 soldiers around him single-handedly. And he was a great fighter. Obviously, he was very old at that time. In fact, I think he was one of the oldest warriors of that war. For if we make a rough calculation, Bhishma was around 80 years old when Yudhishthira was born. We had discussed this at an earlier episode. And he was around 83 when Arjuna was born. And Arjuna and Krishna themselves were 89 or 90 years old when the Mahabharata war was fought. So going by this calculation, Bhishma himself was 170 years old at the time of the Kurukshetra war. Why Arjuna and Krishna were 89 years old at the time of the Kurukshetra war. And so if you assume that Bahalika was the older uncle of Bhishma, Bahalika was easily 205 years old at the time of the war. A grand old man at the time of a Kurukshetra war, a war that was fought absolutely ferociously and bloodily. So, how did Bahalika fare in that great bloody war of Kurukshetra? So, Bahalika lasted for 14 days in the war. And you would wonder, how did he last 14 days? Well, it was quite obvious that for the first 13 days, most of the great Pandava warriors and the great warriors on the Pandava side gave a wide berth to Bahalika and didn't engage him too much in the war. And it so happened that Bahalika managed to last 13 days of the war without being challenged aggressively by any of the Pandavas. Yes, there was a bit of aggression from Satyaki's side, and I'll tell you that story much later. But for most of the war, the great King Bahalika remained untouched by the Pandavas. And then something changed on the 13th day. That was the day Abhimanyu died. And on that great fateful day when the great Abhimanyu fought against all the Maharathis of the Kauravas, who cornered him and surrounded him and fought against him as one, while this young boy stood there in their midst fighting bravely against all of them. Bahalika was one of the Maharathis, the Atirathis who was there present, who did not say anything when everybody was pouncing on Abhimanyu. And since he was present on the day when that fateful day when Abhimanyu died, the day after that he was shown no mercy. The great Bhima Sena, the Vrikodara, that ferocious tiger of the Pandavas, attacked Bahalika the next day on the 14th day of the war, and with his mace, hurling it at Bahalika, shattered his head. And that was the end of Bahalika and the great Kurukshetra war. So Bahalika had a son called Somadatta. Now Somadatta was also a Maharathi, not just an Atirathi. Somadatta was a Maharathi. After Bahalika, he took over the reins of the Bahalika kingdom, and then he was subsequently followed by his son Bhurishravas. So Somadatta had a liking for Devaki, who was incidentally Krishna's mother, Lord Krishna's mother, and wanted to marry Devaki. But there was a king called Shini who had a friend Vasudeva, and Shini was very keen that his friend Vasudeva married Devaki. And so King Shini had a war with Somadatta over who should marry Devaki. And in that war, King Shini was able to defeat Somadatta, and so Somadatta had to retreat. And finally, Devaki married Vasudeva, and from there on was the great Vasudeva Krishna born. And so the kingdom of Shini had an ongoing enmity against Somadatta. And King Shini's grandson was Satyaki, who finally in the great Kurukshetra war was the one who fought with Somadatta and Bhurishravas and landed up killing Somadatta and Bhurishravas. The details of that actual fight I will tell you later when we're discussing the war. But this was a side, it was kind of a gossip we brought in the middle. But then the Mahabharata is anyway a story told of events that happened 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. A large major gossip in its own way. And so on that particular day when Dronacharya came to the court of Hastinapur, there was also present the great King Bahalika. And so Dronacharya entered the court in a beautiful silken robe and wearing silken clothes and a silken shawl, walked in regally announced by the chief announcer of the court. And immediately he went in front of Dhritarashtra, paid his respects. And Dhritarashtra got up and paid his respects back to Dronacharya. Dronacharya then went round paying his respects to all the great royals that were there present in the court, and they in turn gave their respects to Dronacharya. And Dronacharya then announced to Dhritarashtra that the training for the Kuru princes is complete. And Dhritarashtra was overjoyed, and he immediately summoned his servitors to bring gold and all kinds of jewels and silks of immense value to be gifted to Dronacharya. And they were all presented to Dronacharya grandly. And then Dronacharya told Dhritarashtra that he is very happy with the training that he has imparted to the Kuru princes, and he would like to conduct an exhibition so that they could show off what was taught to them and show the people of Hastinapur what great warriors they were, so that the people of Hastinapur could know that they were in safe hands and that the safety of the great Hastinapur was in safe hands. For the princes, the Kuru princes were great warriors who would protect the kingdom of Hastinapur and all the borders of Hastinapur, which extended to the edges of Bharatvarsha in those days. And King Dhritarashtra was overjoyed to know that his children and the children of Pandu had blossomed into such great warriors. And he looked towards Vidura, his younger brother and his closest confidant and his minister, and told him, I want you to help the Guru Dronacharya arrange for this exhibition. This exhibition should be like something never seen ever, and it was after this death of Pandu, this would be the first great excitement that the people of Hastinapur would have. Spare no expense and see to it that this will be the greatest exhibition of all time. And so saying, Dronacharya bowed down and left with Vidura on his, following him to help him out with the arrangements. And so Dronacharya and Vidura then went round searching for a place that would be the ideal place for such an exhibition. And Dronacharya said that such a place should have no shrubs or trees growing on it. It should be a large expanse of land which was absolutely clear, with clear springs and wells dotted over all over the area, so that people who came to watch this exhibition could quench their thirst. And so saying, such a large, beautiful piece of land was identified by Vidura. And Dronacharya decided to have this piece of land consecrated. So where the hymns and chants were conducted, and a great homa was conducted, and a great puja was conducted over this plot of land to consecrate it, to make it pure in preparation for the great exhibition that was to come. And it is said in the Mahabharata that the Shastras describe in great detail every bit and every rule of what should be followed when a great exhibition was to be conducted, and how the constructions around this to be constructed, so that every aspect should be taken care of. We term this thing as Vastu nowadays and term it as Vastu Shastra. And this Vastu Shastra is not some fairy tale or something that is out of imagination. It has its basis on hard science. For this Vastu Shastra takes into account the position of the sun at different times of the day. It takes into account the direction of the wind at a particular time of the year. It takes into account the quality of the water in that land. And it takes into account various aspects that will determine how a particular structure will bear on a particular piece of land. And the Shastras are different for building houses, and the Shastras are different for building exhibition grounds. In an exhibition ground, it is necessary to know on which side the sun glare would come. For you do not want an archer to be blinded by the glare of the sun. It is also necessary to know in which side the wind would blow, for that would affect the archery skills of that particular archer and would affect the accuracy of the archer. And so, taking all this into account, Dronacharya ensured that the stadium would be built exactly according to the Shastras. There were areas which were denoted as stands for the royals, and those would be the stands where the great royals of the Hastinapur kingdom would sit. There would be areas which would be demarcated to be that for the noblemen, and then the areas for the common people. For the common people, large multi-tiered stands were built. And for the areas of the noblemen, it was allowed for the noblemen to plan for themselves how they would like their large, luxurious tents to be laid out. And the stands for the royal family of Hastinapur was something that was unimaginable. It was said that these stands had pearls and jewels dotting the area, had huge arches inlaid with gold, and beautiful carpets which were lined on these areas. And Dronacharya had craftsmen and masons working round the clock to ensure that these stands would be ready in record time. And with these artisans and workmen working round the clock in absolute precision, the Dronacharya demanded, this beautiful exhibition ground was ready within a month. And at the end of the month, Dronacharya went back into the Hastinapur court and announced that all the preparations were ready and it was time for the exhibition. And the date of the exhibition was set at an auspicious time and date. And on that particular day, it was announced that the great Kuru princes, both the Pandavas and the Kauravas, would be called on to demonstrate their archery, and all the public of all the land would be invited to come and witness it. The day before the exhibition, people from all over Hastinapur were thronging to the city to come to watch the princes and see how capable these princes were, whether these princes would be able to secure the borders of their land. And people started streaming in the day before itself, and it seemed like a picnic where people would come and set up a campfire, and through the night they would sit and talk about the various greatness of the Kauravas. Some would talk about the greatness of the Pandavas. Some would praise Arjuna, some would praise Bhima, some would praise Duryodhana. And there was gossip all around where some would be talking about how Arjuna was a favorite of Dronacharya, and this entire exhibition was just created to showcase Arjuna, and the others were just paltry actors in this great exhibition. And so it happened that the entire night was filled with fun and frolic by all the citizenry who had come in expectation to watch this great exhibition the next day. The next day, from early morning, the throng started filling into the stands. The noblemen started coming to their designated royal enclosures, which some of them had themselves designed. And the general public started coming in all the varnas and started coming and taking their place in the multi-tiered stands that had been created around this exhibition area. There was no distinguished area, there was no demarcated area for the separate varnas. They all sat together. The only separate enclosure was for the women who had come without being accompanied by men. And it was ensured that this separate enclosure for women would have all the amenities that would ensure their secrecy and their privacy. And so finally, at the anointed time, the rishis of the land started coming in. Brahmanas had started coming in from early morning and were sitting in a designated area where Vedic chants were being sung from early morning, from the time the sun rose. And the air was rent with trumpets and bugles and various horns being bellowed out in the backdrop of these mantras being chanted continuously and non-stop. And then the announcement came that the royal entourage would enter. And it was a sight to behold, for the royal entourage led by Bhishma and Vidura by the side of Dhritarashtra started to enter this arena. Bhishma took the lead and Dhritarashtra followed close behind with Vidura next to him. Dhritarashtra walking straight and tall, though he was blind. He was using the sounds made by Bhishma standing ahead of him and Vidura coming next to him to identify the lay of the land so that he knew where he had to walk and where the steps would come up and how he would walk. And people were marveling at the way in which the blind king would walk unsupported and unguided. For Dhritarashtra had a keen sense of hearing and could know just from the sounds made by Bhishma and Vidura of where to go and how to walk, and all the obstacles that would come in the way. This was followed by Gandhari, who was being guided by this most beautiful Kunti, and people were gasping at the sight of Gandhari and Kunti walking in. This was followed by Kripacharya, Vedavyasa, and various other noblemen and kings who had come to witness the event. The great Maharishi Vedavyasa was given a separate enclosure to sit in, for he was also the father of Dhritarashtra and one of the most respected rishis of the land. And then, once everyone had taken their seat, Dhritarashtra stood up to announce that the exhibition may start. Then comes in Dronacharya, in absolute white silks and a white gown, his white long hair flowing and billowing in the breeze, and his white beard also billowing in the breeze, with a sacred thread across his chest. This man, the great Dronacharya, with his body covered with white sandalwood paste, looking very much like the moon, walked into the arena, followed by his son Ashwathama, like Mars following behind. And the great Dronacharya, walking erect and tall, with his long limbs and broad shoulders, followed by his brilliant son Ashwathama with a gleaming gem on his face, coming behind him, walking step by step behind him, looking bright and brilliant like two planets entering the arena, walked towards the great king Dhritarashtra and stood in front of him and announced that, "My lord, if we have your leave, we shall now begin the exhibition." And then Dronacharya announced to the people that today you will see in front of you the great Kuru princes who have been trained in his ashrama for the last 12 years. They've been trained in all forms of war and every form of weaponry. And today they will demonstrate to all the people all that they have learnt in the last 12 years. And then Dronacharya laid down the rules for the exhibition. He mentioned that the fights will be as real as ever, but they will not break skin and they will not draw blood. But barring these two limitations, the wars and duels that will be fought between the princes will be as real, will not be choreographed. And so saying, he called in the servitors to bring in the weapons. And then the beautiful gleaming weapons were brought into the arena, shining in the morning sun. They were glittering and the people were awestruck. And the people were screaming in glee at the sight of these beautiful weapons being brought. And the people were excited, and you could make out that there were some who had stories about the Pandavas and there were some who had stories about the Kauravas. And there was already the beginning of a partisanship that was developing in the crowd, with some supporting the Kauravas and some supporting the Pandavas. And this was obvious that such a thing would anyway happen when a large number of citizenry would gather round to discuss the royals. It still happens these days, 7,000 years down the line. And then Dronacharya announced that the warriors, that the great princes shall come in. First to arrive, enter the arena, was Yudhishthira, the eldest of all the brothers, the eldest Pandava, who was elder to even the Kauravas. He was the first to enter. The Mahabharata gives a beautiful description of Yudhishthira as he walked in. It is said that Yudhishthira was a tall man with a gait like a ferocious lion. He was said to be 4 cubits in height. So if you consider a cubit to be from the tip of your finger to the elbow, in their huge bodies, that would be around 1.5 feet, a little more than 1.5 feet. And so 4 cubits of height would be a little more than 6 feet in height. And entered walking like a lion, like a ferocious lion with a gait like a lion. He was extremely fair with a long, sharp, aquiline nose which shone out. His eyes were the color of copper, and his hair was long and wavy. His shoulders were broad, his arms were huge. And as he walked, the earth thundered under him, and this ferocious lion of a man with his hair billowing in the breeze, a long, large nose and coppery red eyes, walked into the arena. Following him was the great Bhima Sena of Vrikodara. Vrikodara, the terrible Vrikodara, who followed him. A man of immense proportions, as tall as a palmyra tree, which was probably 9 or 10 feet high, of immensely broad shoulders and huge arms. It is said that Vrikodara had long wavy hair, eyes like burnished copper, skin like liquid heated gold, absolutely fair, quite like the pure gold skin of his brother Yudhishthira. This great Bhimasena towered over everyone else around. And as he strode into the arena, it is said that he had a walk of a ferocious elephant which was in anger, which was leading its herd. This ferocious elephant, as he walked, thundered across with the ground trembling with every step he took. His eyes the color of honey. This great Vrikodara entered the arena after Yudhishthira. This was followed by Duryodhana, who was a little shorter than Bhimasena but just as large, with broad shoulders and huge arms, arms the size of tree trunks. And as he walked, he too looked like an elephant who was absolutely angry and ferocious. And it looked like he would trample everyone around him. And he was tall and beautiful and handsome, but his eyes looked like serpents, and his forehead was like a hooded serpent's head. And then was followed by the various Kaurava brothers, all other 99 of them. And then finally came in Arjuna. Arjuna was said to be as tall as Bhima, just a thumb shorter than Bhima. Arjuna was dark in complexion. He was greyish black in complexion, the color of the bark of the Arjuna tree from where he got his name. He had eyes the color of burnished copper or hazel eyes, curly hair on his head, a beautiful youthful appearance on his skin, broad shoulders and long arms going right down to his knee. It was said that Arjuna had a youthfulness in his skin which stayed with him well past his middle age. His gait was like that of a sporting elephant, an elephant which bore absolute strength but a jump in its gait. And as he walked forward, his ornaments gleaming on his dark skin, it was said that the women swooned and the women screamed, seeing this great absolute representation of a man. And this was followed by the twins Nakula and Sahadeva. Nakula was said to be absolutely handsome and dark, while Sahadeva was fair. Nakula had an absolute brilliance about him, and broad-shouldered and narrow-waisted, this young man who was dark, with long hair coming down to his shoulders. It was said that he was one of the most handsome among all the men. And he and Sahadeva, as they walked, people screamed and the crowd shouted. Such was the description of the Pandavas and the Kauravas that were given as they entered the arena. They all went to the stands where the king and the courtiers were sitting and paid their respects to Dhritarashtra. Kunti was seeing her children for the first time after 12 years. How they had blossomed from the young teenage boys she had left to the Gurukula. They had become men now, men of steel, men of great power and men of courage. And sitting next to Dhritarashtra was Vidura, who was Dhritarashtra's eyes. Vidura would sit next to Dhritarashtra and recount everything that happened in that arena. Vidura gave an exquisite description of every one of these princes to Dhritarashtra. And as he told about the Kaurava princes who entered, Dhritarashtra's heart welled with pride for his sons. And even as Vidura would announce the Pandavas, he looked at Vidura and say that my brother Pandu has given rise to 5 beautiful fires. These fires would guard our kingdom, and I'm really lucky to have these fires burning in our Hastinapura. And on the other side, it was Kunti who sat next to Gandhari and gave a verbatim description of everything that happened to to her co-sister Gandhari. And while she described her own children, her heart swelled with pride and she could barely contain herself. But she tried not to sound too excited for it. She didn't want Gandhari to feel that she was talking a little more about her own children than those of Gandhari's children. And so it's happened that these young men came and formed a circle around the arena and started walking around the arena, close to the stand so that everyone in the arena could get a look at, glimpse at them, glimpse at the future rulers of this great Hastinapur kingdom. This was an exhibition like no other, and it is said that it was the first great joyous occasion after the death of Pandu and Madri. And the people were absolutely overjoyed at seeing the princes walk around. And once the Kuru princes, both the Pandavas and the Kauravas, had had their introductory circle around the arena, Dronacharya called them to a tight circle. He then announced to them the rules of the warfare that was to follow. And following this, he summoned the horses. And then the air was rent with a thundering sound and a vibration as 105 galloping horses entered the arena. And these princes, one by one, jumped onto these galloping horses effortlessly and circled the arena. They then guided their horses to the armory, the area where the weapons were kept, and effortlessly at full gallop snatched up their bows and the quiver of arrows, and then started galloping around the arena. Ashwathama, in the meantime, had kept a wooden revolving boar in the center of the arena. And these princes all one by one started shooting their arrows onto the bow, while at full gallop, till within a short span of time, that wild boar resembled a porcupine with the arrows all jutting out of it. Not a single arrow missed their mark. And then one by one, these great warriors separated from the formation of the circle and got into the center of the arena. They then started picking up individual weapons one by one. Some picked up the swords, and then two warriors on each on horseback would have a sword fight with each other. Some would pick up the mace, and two warriors with maces would have a mace fight with each other, and some would fight with their javelin. And this continued as various Kauravas and Pandava brothers would take up various weapons and engage in various types of warfare with each other, duels with each other, exhibiting shows of strength. And all that talk which happened the previous day, that Arjuna was the main key feature of this event, and this entire event was being done for Arjuna's sake, vanished in thin air as the crowd started screaming in ecstasy, seeing their princes, their brave, handsome warrior princes fight it out with each other. The duels were almost realistic, and the people were wondering how they didn't draw blood from each other. But so great was their expertise that every blow would be met with an effective parry, and not a single time would the sword, which were sharp swords, meet skin. Such was the effectiveness and the elegance with which these warriors fought. They were all duels, not mock duels. They were serious duels. Sometimes they would be quite serious. And Ashwathama would go in to pry the two apart. And then finally Dronacharya announced that the eldest Kaurava brother would then come and have a mace duel with the second Pandava brother. And this was a highly anticipated moment of the event. Anticipated by the crowds and anticipated by both Bhima and Duryodhana themselves. And then thundered into the crowd, into the center of the arena, like two elephants waiting to fight. Kicking the ground down and kicking the dust up, entered the two great warriors from either side. Bhima Sena of Vrikodar on one side and Duryodhana on the other. In fact, interestingly, when the announcements were happening, the multiple names for these people were also being announced. Yudhishthira was also announced as Ajatashatru. Bhima announced as Vrikodara, and Duryodhana announced as Suyodhana. So Duryodhana's name in that time was Suyodhana, meaning the one who fought excellently. It was only much later, when the evil effects of Duryodhana started coming into play, that Suyodhana started being referred to as by Duryodhana, and the crowd started shouting. And this was when the crowd also became partisan. Some in the crowd started shouting for Suyodhana, and some in the crowd started shouting for Bhimasena. And Duryodhana signaled to his son Ashwathama to come by, and warned him and told him that this battle will get ferocious, that these two will try to draw blood from each other and break each other's skin. Be alert and be aware that if either of these two happen, or if the crowd becomes too partisan, that the crowd start fighting among themselves, ensure that these two warriors are pulled apart. And so Ashwathama stood by with his mace in hand, carefully monitoring the happenings and the duel between the great two Bhimasena and Duryodhana. And they started off immediately. With a wild roar, Bhimasena ran against Duryodhana and tried to hit his chest with the mace. But Duryodhana easily moved away and swung himself around, and with the backhand hit the mace on Bhimasena's shoulder. It hit Bhimasena with extreme force, but Bhimasena hardly even shivered or trembled. And he swung his mace on Duryodhana, almost instantly getting him on his shoulder. And then Bhimasena took a low blow against Duryodhana and swung his mace. But Duryodhana easily leapt 6 or 7 feet into the air, missing that blow. And from that height, he jumped down on Bhimasena, almost trying to bash the skull in with his mace. But Bhimasena was extremely agile. In fact, the two, though hugely built, was so agile that it surprised the people that such huge men could have such agility. And as Duryodhana brought down the death blow of his mace on Bhimasena, Bhimasena immediately moved away, and the mace hit the ground, and Duryodhana lost his balance. And in that instant, Bhimasena whacked his mace on Duryodhana's back, sending him sprawling down. And the crowds erupted in glee, especially the ones who were supporting Bhimasena at seeing Duryodhana sprawled on the ground. Duryodhana was up in an instant, with an agility that would commonly be seen in a man much thinner and smaller than him. And his brow was angry and his eyes were red in anger. And now he let loose at Bhimasena a barrage of blows, which Bhimasena with great difficulty was able to parry with his own mace. And as the duel progressed, the crowd became more and more partisan. The blows became more and more fierce and more hard. And Drona realized that the next blow would draw blood, and he signaled to Ashwathama. And as Bhimasena and Duryodhana rushed to each other in absolute anger, Ashwathama got into the way. It was only Ashwathama's brilliant agility himself and the use of his mace with which he was able to stave off the deathly blow of Duryodhana, which was aimed towards Bhimasena's face. And while Bhimasena hurled his mace at Duryodhana, Ashwathama was able to kick it free. I am sure that blow to his leg would have hurt Ashwathama to no end. But Ashwathama was able to hold Duryodhana and Bhimasena's hand apart and started screaming at them to move apart. And with regret that they were not able to kill the other in this duel, the two growling warriors started to move apart, pushed by Ashwathama. And as Ashwathama limped out of that area, everybody knew the superhuman feat that Ashwathama had performed by keeping these two great warriors apart. And then Dronacharya came in to announce Arjuna. And Dronacharya announced to the gathering that now I call on Arjuna, who is dearer to me than my own son Ashwathama. I call on him to show you his prowess. Then entered Arjuna. And as Arjuna galloped around the arena, people were screaming in glee. The people who even had the soft corner for the Kauravas were screaming in glee at seeing the handsome dark prince on his horse. A huge man with broad shoulders, long arms, and a long bow on his hand, twanging the string of the bow and creating a sound that brought fear into the people's hearts. And then Ashwathama threw an empty quiver into the air in the center of the arena, and Arjuna, in an instant, with the blink of an eye, filled it with 21 arrows. And then Ashwathama set up a spinning face of a boar, which spun at rapid speed around, and Arjuna, in absolute precision and accuracy, while galloping at breakneck speed around the arena, fitted in 25 arrows onto that head of the boar with absolute precision, not a single arrow missing its mark. And then, with a glance from Drona, Arjuna started his demonstration of the astras. Then Arjuna took an arrow on his bow, and he muttered a mantra and he let loose the arrow. And this arrow, once it left the bow, seemed to hang in mid-air. And this arrow suddenly caught fire, a small fire which gradually increased in size as the arrow started floating away from Arjuna. And as the distance of the arrow started increasing from Arjuna, the size of the flame emanating from the arrow started becoming bigger and bigger, till it formed a large conflagration which the people in the audience thought may envelop the entire arena. And as the flame started becoming bigger and bigger to almost envelop the entire arena, Arjuna muttered another mantra and let loose the Varunastra. And the Varunastra was like a sea inverted in the sky, and which suddenly drenched the entire Agnyastra, extinguishing it. And there were waves in the air that danced around. And then Arjuna invoked the Parjanyastra, which, when invoked, brought out large clouds in the sky and thunder and lightning and a spell of rain. And then the Vayu Astra, which Arjuna invoked, drove these clouds away and the skies cleared again. And then Arjuna brought the Bhaumastra, which he shot into the earth. And as he shot the Bhaumastra into the earth split open and Arjuna started to walk into the heart of the earth. And Arjuna disappeared from view, and as Arjuna walked under the earth, there were cracks heard all over, and the earth trembled, as it seemed that the bowels of the earth were opening, making way for Arjuna. And finally, Arjuna came out on the other side of the arena as the earth cracked open. And as he walked back, he let out another astra, and the entire ground closed up like there was nothing there. And then with one astra, Arjuna became minuscule like a homunculus, and Ashwatthama had to point out to the entire audience where Arjuna lay, and with another astra, he became double the size, double his own size, and with another astra, he disappeared. And the people were so enthralled by this absolutely phenomenal show that they were screaming, and the partisanship that had developed initially at the fight of Bhima and Vrikodra and Suyodhana disappeared, and they were all in absolute glee. And then Arjuna got down from his chariot to take a bow, and there was suddenly a retort in the air. There was a sound in the air like a thunderclap. There was a sound in the air like the heavens may come down. There was a sound like the earth was splitting. And the sound came from the entrance of the arena. And the people were shocked. They thought it was Arjuna who had created the sound. But Arjuna seemed just as shocked in hearing the large sound that came from the entrance of the arena. And there, walking in regally, was Vasusena, Karna. Karna's original name was Vasusena, as kept by his parents, Atiratha and Radha. And there, walked in through the entrance, was Vasusena. Vasusena, because he was born with the beautiful golden mail of armor and beautiful golden earrings. And since he was born from wealth, his parents called him Vasusena. And so entered this beautiful, handsome man, a man tall as Bhima Sena, golden skin shining bright. It was as if a sunbeam was following him wherever he walked. Shoulders as broad as Bhimasena and arms as huge as Bhimasena, he walked like a ferocious lion. And it was said his face shone like the sun with the loveliness of the moon and a sparkle like fire, like Agni himself. The beauty of Soma on the face was irrepressible. And as he thundered in with his large bow and a quiver of arrows, everyone stared at him. This was a man who walked, and as he walked, the shining coat of armor, which was stuck to his skin and moved with his skin, seemed to glitter in that sunbeam that shone down on him, and his beautiful golden earrings sparkled in the sun. And this was how Karna came into the Rangabhoomi, the exhibition match. We shall talk about the life of Karna, of how he came to be at this point of time in the next episode. But for now, we know that history is going to be made with the two perpetual rivals, Arjuna and Karna, facing each other in contempt. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendra Namaha. Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Anjaneyaya Namaha, Om Subramanyaya Namaha, Swami Sharanamayyappo, Om Guruve Namaha.